Hi, Aidan. Thank you so
Hi,
much for
Max.
joining.
Great to see you.
We are planning to have quite an extended discussion about the TFFF in this kind of like first episode of some video podcast we are about to do about the whole TFFF analysis. And why don't you start with introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm a professor of economics at the University of Calgary and also the head of the department. And I've been working with Max for quite a few years now, looking at issues around how to pay for global public goods.
Perfect. Yeah, and Professor Hollis is located in Calgary, Canada, and I'm joining this call from Berlin. That's why I'm super dark around here. I'm Max Alexander Matthey, doing a PhD about the incentive mechanisms in global commons, with a focus on results-based payment mechanisms. And I came across the TFFF last year at my very first COP in Baku and was a bit confused about the concept even when joining a first presentation about the TFFF back in last November. And quite randomly this summer in Bonn, where there's some kind of like halftime show negotiations of the global climate conferences that is now taking place in Belém, Brazil. I met a journalist who said, "Hey, Max, have you taken another look at the TFFF? I don't think they changed the mechanism too much, and you had so many concerns. So why don't you take another look?" And that's what I did, and that's how this whole project of ours was born. A bit late to the party, honestly, because it was in, I'm not quite sure, like June or July. And yeah, we've been doing this analysis on the TFFF and the newsletter ever since. But Aidan, maybe as a start, let's describe what the TFFF is really about at its core.
Sure. So the first thing to understand is that the TFFF is all about supporting governments and creating incentives for governments to protect tropical forests, which is a fantastic thing and very important. And so the underlying idea of the TFFF is something that we both strongly support. We love the idea of what it is that the TFFF is trying to do and think that it should be properly funded. So that's the first thing to emphasize. But what we really want to focus on here is that the TFFF is basically saying what we need to have is a few $1 billion a year, maybe, they're saying in between 1.6 billion or something and 4 billion a year, um, which is going to be given to tropical forest countries. So how are they going to come up with the money? That's the big challenge.
Right.
So, Max, you want to have a go?
Yeah, maybe about the core concept of the TFFF. So as you just said, the long-term target of the TFFF would be to pay between 2.5 billion and up to 4 billion for the rainforest premiums, and every single hectare globally of rainforest should get $4 paid in annual revenues. So there's about a billion hectares of rainforest on the globe. And with $4 for every hectare, this adds up to the 4 billion that the TFFF would need at a maximum. If there's no deforestation, $4 billion would be needed for these rewards. And a lot of people have criticized the $4 for being too low, right? And this is kind of a misunderstanding of the core concept, because what it's really about is not the $4 that are being paid as rewards, but the more decisive amount is really the $400 penalty that rainforest countries would get if they deforest a hectare of rainforest. So maybe as a really easy example, Aidan, you live in the Hollis state and you have 1,000 hectares of rainforest in your country. You would get 1,000 hectares times $4, so a total premium of $4,000 every year. And as soon as you deforest only 1 hectare, so 1,000th of your total rainforest territory, you would already reduce this premium from 4,000 by $400 down to 3,600. So if you do your like trade-off calculations, should you deforest this hectare or not, the really important value here is the $400 penalty and not the $4 that you actually get for that reward.
Right. An important thing to understand about how the TFF is supposed to work. And it's not just um, it's there's also a kind of confusion that some people say, look, this is about monetizing the rainforest or something. It's about turning it into something financial. I mean, it's not. It's really just about trying to create proper incentives for and the resources for governments in countries with tropical rainforests to protect those rainforests. So, ironically, rather than when people say this is about turning it into a financial asset, it's not. It's about just recognizing that it has a value when it's not being burned down and turned into land for grazing cattle.
Right.
So it's really it's actually a great mechanism, and because it's supposed to operate on a global scale, it could actually work really, really well. But there's a problem with raising money for kind of any global environmental concerns. It turns out that actually there doesn't seem to be enough support for that. So the solution has been to be kind of financially innovative. And so the structure of the TFFF and the way that they're hoping to raise that $4 billion is to borrow two tranches of money. So 25 billion from sponsor countries. For example, Norway has already offered up 3 billion of this 25, and another 100 billion from mainly institutional investors like pension funds or whatever. And then to take this, and all of that would be interest-bearing debt. So they
Right.
would borrow at, and they're talking about borrowing at around 5 or 6%, and then invest that amount of money, that 125 billion, mostly or almost entirely into higher interest-bearing bonds, emerging market debt from countries in emerging markets like South Africa, Brazil, or Indonesia. So that's the basic idea. So basically, borrow at around 5%, lend at 8%, and then you've got a 3% margin, which you hope you can then apply. And the idea is that could turn into roughly $4 billion of net interest profits per year.
Right. Yeah, coming back to one of the criticisms that you just mentioned, I just really want to stress that before moving ahead. The idea to criticize the TFFF for commercializing the rainforest, when what it really does is preventing the commercialization of the rainforest by paying to not commercialize it. I just find that so weird. But I like a lot of stakeholders have been articulating this kind of critique, and I really think that the TFFF is much more promising than a lot of the critique that has been out there claims it to be. But Aidan, let's stick to the 125 billion and this whole claim that there's a magic money tree on financial markets, or more specific, emerging market bonds. So if it were true that this spread between 5 and 8% were up for grabs, one of the basic non-logic arguments behind the TFFF is, why would you lure in private capital? Why would you mobilize private capital in some not really blended finance mechanism when there is free money up for grabs, right? Can you elaborate on that?
No, I don't understand. I don't understand that.
So if there's a free 3% from a magic money tree on bond markets, right? Why would you try to get private capital in there and even insuring it against losses? And we'll get into this topic later on. Why would states not invest the whole 125 billion themselves? Because if there's a free roll on capital markets, if you can reliably make 3% on a loan, why would you want to share it with private investors? And why would you even lure them in with a great deal by protecting them against losses? I don't think that adds up, right?
It's really puzzling. So, I mean, I guess the question of why a high-income country like Germany wouldn't just basically issue bonds and then invest in a diversified portfolio of emerging market debt and clean up on the difference between the interest that they're paying and the interest that they're receiving. Well, I mean, if that could work, of course, countries should be doing it, and they could reduce taxes a lot.
Right.
So I guess it's extra puzzling that in the TFFF, the idea is there's going to be just one chunk of state, like the $25 billion from state sponsors, and then another 100 billion of institutional investment. And in fact, when you look at the concept note 3.1 that the TFFF has issued, they say because they're going to have to pay more for that institutional debt, it's going to raise their cost of the 125 billion, the cost of interest, by between 0.7% and around 1.4% per year. So they're actually expecting it to increase their costs massively, and of course, therefore, reduce the interest rate spread that they'd be able to earn. So it is a little bit odd, and the only logic to it is that they're hoping to hide how much money that sponsor countries have to put up and put at risk.
Right.
Because the underlying design of uh, the way that they've got this 25 and then 100 separately, the underlying design of that is that the sponsor countries, which are going to give that 25 billion, will be first at risk. So if there are losses, they're the ones who don't get paid, and their money is first at risk, whereas the other 100 billion is somewhat protected. Still going to be more expensive to borrow from them than from the state sponsors.
Right. So talking about this leverage of 5x and the state funding of 25 billion, kind of protecting the 100 billion of private investor capital from losses, let's quickly jump on our first edition of the TFFF Missing Billions newsletter. And why don't you describe this graph that is out of concept note, both 3.0 and the latest one, 3.1? It kind of ends at 100. It starts in the middle of nowhere. It's jumping quite a bit. What does this really mean? Can you elaborate on this graph?
Sure. So the idea of this graph was that the TFFF had asked some analysts to do a kind of a review of what the kind of risk of losses might be if they had the same kind of portfolio that they're thinking of having in the future, if they'd had that in the past. So if you invested $100, what would the value of that asset have looked like? So they're investing at, if you like, $100 today and then going backwards. So it's a little bit puzzling. But what do we get out of this? Well, what you can see is when they look at it, they say, hey, most of the time, this is around $100. It starts, it ends at 100, and then if you go backwards, it stays more or less at around 100 most of the time, sometimes a little bit higher, and then sometimes there's some little crevasses that show up, but most of the time the value is pretty high, and that's the point that they try to make is that they see the value as being almost always staying pretty stable, except, there are these occasional dips when it becomes really significantly less. And during those dips, of course, you'll recall that the idea was that the sponsor countries would invest 20%, and then the other 80% would be invested by institutional investors. That as long as the money stays above 80%, then the only potential loss is to the sponsor countries. And so the idea here is that it's going to be possible to have a pretty good credit score for that for the institutional investors, that they'd be willing to accept maybe a AAA rating for bonds issued by the TFFF, as long as the first 20% of any losses were taken by the sponsor countries. And when we looked at this, we thought, well, it's kind of weird that it stops like in 2003. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, and
And so,
it was even
yeah,
weirder because it doesn't stop at 2005, right? But it's like a 22 and a couple of month period that is being shown in the graph. It's
yeah,
not
although they
looking
say
back
that,
20 years.
yeah, they say it's 20 years, but it's not really 20 years. It's like, yeah, 22 years and a bit.
Right. And
So
as it
we
says
wondered,
here, there is a catch, right? The framing that they are using, and also when we talked about with people who are close to the developing team of the TFFF, you just have to wait in times of crisis till markets normalize, and then you're back at 100. So this idea that markets always go back to 100, and if you hold on to your bonds, you will be fine in the end, that is quite strong in the framing of TFFF. But there's a catch, Aidan. So what's the catch about this graph?
so we kind of wondered what the numbers look like if you went a little bit further back. because we know that there were actually problems in emerging market bonds in the early 2000s, and that seems to have been excluded from this. And in fact, there were even worse problems in the 1990s. That's also excluded. So we got some more data to go back to 2000, and that's as far back as we could go.
Right. So just to quickly stress what happened in the 90s, there was the so-called Asian bond crisis, which was huge for emerging market debt. And Mexico defaulted in 95, I think. There was Pakistan in 97 and Russia quite famously in 98, right? So the 90s were also very bad for emerging market bonds. But it's really hard to find the data for back in the 90s. Um, and then in the beginning of the 2000s, there was the Argentinian default in 2001. And then Brazil got bailed out by the International Monetary Fund in, I think, 2002 and 3. And we actually managed to find this data. So I'll share screen again, Aidan. And why don't you elaborate on this red graph that we added to the data published in Concept Note 3?
So this data comes from the Emerging Market Bond Index, which is what the TFFF has used to create the green line. And if you just extend the green line back using exactly the same emerging market bond index, oh, it's really not pretty. And yet somehow this has been excluded from the presentation made by the TFFF, which frankly I think is unfair.
Remarkable, to say the least.
Um, yeah. And you can see that things are actually pretty bad at that time. And if you include this data, then things look a little bit more challenging. So just to be clear, that the graph doesn't go down to zero, right? It goes to only
Right.
50%. But 50% is, and most of, for that entire period of years, the value of the emerging market bonds would have been less than 80%,
Right.
which would mean that for years, a period of years, there would in fact not have been the value there to continue to keep sponsor countries whole. I mean, they would have had zero asset, and it would have been really difficult to induce institutional investors to participate in this either.
Yeah. So we are not only talking about a stop in rainforest premiums here, but with crises like in the beginning of the 2000s, it might even be the case that the TFFF would kind of go bankrupt as a whole, right? Because the state money could get lost because it's a 5x leverage. With every 20% of realized losses, um, the whole public funding would just disappear, right? Flowing
Right, and
into
that
the
would
hands
mean
of
Yeah, well, I was going to say that would mean that from the perspective of institutional investors, they would now be holding not, a debt that was protected by a 20% buffer, right? They'd instead be holding bonds that were really just emerging market, debt, and there would be no buffer at all. And so at that point, they'd be looking for an appropriate compensation, and not the kind of 5% payment that, based on AAA risk that the TFFF has proposed would be appropriate.
Exactly, exactly. Um, so we talked a bit about the defaults that happened in emerging markets, and we saw in the graph that we just showed that emerging market bonds have been fluctuating even in the last 20 years that have been shown in the graph. And um, the core of the TFFF and its claim that it's able to generate up to 4 billion every year is that the spread between the borrowing at 5% and the lending at 8%, this 3% is kind of like up for grabs for rainforest premiums to be distributed. And the core logic of the 125 billion is really 3% of 125 billion is approximately 4 billion. It's 3.75 billion. And if the fund would generate that money long term, you would actually be able to pay $4 for every hectare. But then in a pretty recent post, we took a deeper dive into what this 3% spread is really all about. Give a quick introduction, Aidan, please, and I'll open up the article as you speak.
Sure. I mean, this is really all about what's expected, right? So if you're an investor today, you have to be thinking about, of course, not exactly what happened in the past, although that's relevant for helping to shape your expectations, but what's expected in the future. And so what can you expect in the future? You don't really know what's coming, but you could reasonably expect that there are going to be some defaults if you're holding this basically high interest bonds. I mean, that's why they're not rated AAA.
Right.
It's because there is a risk of defaults. And so nobody knows exactly, what the risk is, but institutional investors are not crazy either. And if they thought that the risk of defaults was really low, then they would be willing to accept a lower interest rate. And if they thought the risk of default is really high, then they demand a high interest rate. And so basically, what it tells you is if you expect that you're going to be able to earn 8% interest rate from a portfolio of emerging market bonds, that some pretty significant share of the differential, the extra percentages that you're going to earn, is going to be basically taken up by defaults. Do you want to show the graph?
Right. Before showing the graph, here is the what B-rated really means article out of our newsletter. And Mexico is missing here. I need to edit that. But here's a very long list of all the defaults that happened in emerging markets. And it's really, this is not all countries that defaulted since 95. It's only those countries that were rated in the B category, in the moderate risk category before defaulting. So all these countries, if you think about the TFFF being introduced in 97 already, all these countries would be falling into the investment category of TFFF, but then still default later on. And you already described that the 3% gap somewhat needs to be adjusted because these expected defaults will happen. So there is another post that we shared about the 3% spread illusion and how it can be rationalized down to 0.5%. Maybe going through this step-by-step mechanism quickly, we have the 5%, which is the cost of capital by borrowing from donor
Maybe you
countries.
could just increase the size of the screen there, Max.
Yeah, for sure. That should be working, right? Can you see it properly?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Perfect. So the 5% is the debt cost of investors' capital. The TFFF would need to pay 5% to the sponsor governments, and it would then invest in an average of 8% yield in emerging market bonds. And the 3% is this potential yield that the TFFF could actually generate. But then if you look closer into this 3% yield, and it's exactly what we discussed earlier, a significant share of these 3% are not just up for grabs and a free lunch, but they are expected default losses, right? Because emerging market economies can't pay on their debt on a regular basis, you have to kind of put money aside to be able to compensate in case of losses. So this is really expected losses over time. And the actual return that you get within this 3% spread carry trade, which the finance geeks are calling this kind of strategy, is only down to 1%. And what is really important here is that the 1% yield and 1% of 125 billion would be $1 billion and $250 million, right? So it wouldn't be enough to pay $4 per hectare, but only $1.25, even in a good scenario. And that is before cost. But then there's quite immense cost in the TFFF as well. And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. There are two important sets of costs, which Max has in this diagram. And the first set of costs relates to the management costs of the TFFF itself. So it would be, an intergovernmental bureaucracy. I mean, not to be, cruel about this, but they're not known to be super low cost. Because they have to be responsive to many governments, and they're complicated. So you would expect that and they've got to do a lot of things in the TFFF. You got to monitor whether or receive the monitoring information from satellites about whether a forest has been degraded down to the point where it's no longer considered viable rainforest. And then you'd have to fight with countries over whether, in fact, they'd say, well, it really is still good rainforest, or it's not our fault, or whatever. And then you have to have a discussion with them about, whether it was still good rainforest. And in principle, it's sort of like super easy to figure out. You just look at the satellite image and you can tell. But of course, everything's always a bit more difficult and nuanced. And as soon as there's real money on the table, countries are going to fight to make sure that they get paid out. And it will be a little bit tricky for the TFFF to figure out whether, in fact, you know, rainforest qualifies as still being there or whether it's been lost.
Right.
So that's one set of problems. And you just have to have a whole bureaucracy to do this. I think they've also planned to be able to ensure and track whether the money that goes to governments is actually incremental spending on rainforest protection, whether 20% goes to indigenous and community groups. So they're planning to really track all of this stuff and to have policies around that. It's all complicated. So
Right.
it's going to be expensive to run that. And typical, it would be reasonable to expect that's going to cost at least hundreds of millions of dollars per year with thousands, at least hundreds of employees flying around the globe and attending conferences. So all expensive. At the same time, you got to pay your financial people because
Right.
they're talking about basically trying to raise money from institutional investors, from sponsor countries. And so they're going to be issuing bonds and they'll have to have underwriting fees, trustee fees, the whole thing. It's expensive. So they're going to issue all these bonds that's going to cost a bunch of money and it has to be managed, right? And then you've got $125 billion to invest.
Right.
So typical management fees on, just investing, if you look at kind of a mutual fund or an ETF or whatever it is, you're still looking at, kind of 15 to 30 basis points or like a 0.15 to 0.3% might be a reasonable kind of management fees. And that's just for the investing side.
Right.
So add it all up, and you're looking at, well, it wouldn't be crazy to spend, at least 0.5% on just the financial costs plus the management costs of the TFFF.
Right. So this is quite a nice overview about how the 8% are really put into like little chunks to make this clear. So 5% go for the cost of capital. Another 2% is because of the BB rated bonds that default every now and then, and you have to be sure that you have money aside to cope for these losses in return. And then, as you said, there's at least 0.5% of management cost, financial fees, and administration. So what we are really left with in a fully functioning TFFF with 125 billion invested is 0.5% of return expected long term that can actually be spent on the rainforest. So this would be approximately 600 million. And that would only be enough to pay out 60 cents per hectare rather than $4, right? Because the 3% is not a free lunch. The only actual risk premium that you can actually earn long term from this trade is only 0.5%, or rather 1% minus cost, so 0.5%. And what we've been stressing in our analysis for like month now is exactly this sentence here, right? The 3% spread is not a free lunch. It's not the magic money tree that is out there to be harvested by a supranational intergovernmental hedge fund, but it is a risk premium, and a risk premium that comes with long-term expected default losses and cost. So a lot of people have addressed our critique, and because well, I've been writing these news or publishing these newspaper articles. Some people have said, like, don't listen to German Max. He is alone with his analysis. I kept on stressing that Professor Aidan Hollis from University of Calgary is sharing this analysis. We put up this table briefings piece. It's, I don't know, like a month ago now, right? But a lot of people have said, well, we are a lone voice out there, and why should anyone trust what we are saying when so many financial institutions have been supportive of the TFFF? And maybe say a few things about that, because I am just about to open up the pretty prominent supporter of our claims that published their analysis just last week.
Sure. I mean, I think it's actually kind of instructive to observe that while people might question you, um, the TFFF has yet to actually make public any analysis. So it says, oh, the World Bank has agreed to be a trustee and they're supportive. Where's their analysis of the TFFF strategy? There's a ratings agency. Where's their analysis? What banks have been supportive and provided an analysis? There's none. There is literally no public analysis of the TFFF's financial strategy available except published by the TFFF itself.
Right. One of the core arguments that came about, though, is support is just as Barclays on the landing page of the TFFF, right? It's Barclays, it's Bank of America. Later, there's PIMCO as well. I'm not sure there it is. So a lot of financial institutions have been quite prominent in their support of the TFFF, and that's why it was quite a hard point to sell, really. That despite them supporting the mechanism, there's something deeply wrong with the approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, although they say, yeah, we think this is great. It's an opportunity for banks to make a lot of money, so go ahead. Um, I mean, it's they haven't actually published an analysis which says, hey, we've done a hard look at this, and this is the view of here some named analysts at our bank.
Yeah, maybe the point that we've missed earlier, and it was kind of implicitly in our discussion already, you referred to the financial fees and management cost of actually investing that money being somewhere between 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% of the fund. And the concept note 3.1 even claims so. But what does that mean in numbers, right? 0.2% of 125 billion is $250 million of financial fees and management cost every year, right? So it's quite a significant amount of money.
Yep, I'll do it.
And one more thing, you said that there was no risk analysis being published, and that's not exactly right, right? Because in Concept Note 3.0, there actually was some kind of vague risk analysis published. What happened to that one, Aidan?
I mean, that has been kind of withdrawn 3.0, and it's now kind of dropped. And they when they moved to Concept Note 3.1, the risk analysis section seems to have kind of disappeared.
Yeah, we scrutinized it quite a bit, I think, and their reaction was not to make clear what the core data is or how the concept works, what assumptions are behind that risk analysis that they published. They made broad claims that the total default chance is below 1% over the complete 40 years. It didn't really add up. It didn't make too much sense, even if you only look back in the 20 years that they actually published the graph on. But still, there is no risk analysis left in Concept Note 3.1. But then back to our point that the 3% are not risk premium, are not a free roll, but rather a risk premium. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and things are measured in followers nowadays. So Bloomberg New Energy Finance has 700,000 followers on LinkedIn, and they are a think tank about climate policy and industry transitions, both in the global north and the global south. They just published their biodiversity finance fact book, the COP30 edition. And what they say there is quite remarkable, right? Because it seems a bit familiar. The 3% spread is not a money faucet, but a risk premium. So it's not only the two of us, Aidan, making bold claims about how TFFF would not be feasible for creating billions and billions reliably over time, but Bloomberg New Energy Finance is part of the discussion since, I think, 10 days ago or something like that.
Yeah, let me add one more thing that it's certainly not just the two of us. I mean, you can buy insurance against defaults in the emerging market bond index. And so what are those what does that cost? It's depends on kind of exactly the portfolio that you're looking at. But between 2 to 4% kind of is a typical insurance rate. So the TFFF could actually buy insurance and protect itself from defaults, and that would cost it, well, all of the spread.
Exactly.
That would eat it all up. So that's like the market. The market is telling you that's what it costs to protect yourself against defaults because that's the risk out there. Or another way of thinking about that, countries which are, the sponsor countries, if they're going to invest 25 billion and then be the kind of risk buffer for another 100 billion, it's like they're selling insurance or offering up insurance on 125 billion dollars on emerging market debt, and then just giving away the premium. So essentially, that's really what's going on here. I mean, if they wanted to, they could in fact do exactly that, earn the premium, and then give the premium to the TFFF.
Um, we might run into danger of being a bit more technical for a lot of our viewers and listeners here, but as for nearly any topic around the TFFF, there is a publication in the TFFF Missing Billions newsletter how the TFFF is basically the same as selling insurance on emerging market debt. So Aidan, we discussed how the 3% is not really a free lunch, how it could be compared to selling credit default swaps on global bond markets.
Or
And that
insurance. You
they
can just think of it as insurance.
exactly talking about being too technical. And that the real profit inside the 3% spread is rather 0.5% than 3%, and that the cost of the TFFF will certainly be above 300 million, if not more. So right now, Norway has committed to participate up to 3 billion into the TFFF, but only conditional of being not more than 20% of the total amount, and conditional of at least 10 billion flowing into the TFFF. And while France has also declared that they will participate with, I think it's 500 million, but only over a time period of 10 years. So I'm not exactly sure how this will make any sense. But there surely is Indonesia and Brazil both wanting to participate with 1 billion each. So right now the TFFF is in the total amount of $5.5 billion, and it really needs 10 billion because otherwise the Norwegians would be out again, right?
Right. And since if it gets to 10 billion, Norway will only be paying 2 billion because they're only going to give 20%. So there's quite a few billion that are still needed to get there.
Okay, so then it's not 5.5, but only 4.5 that we have right now. So 5.5 are missing then, right?
Yes, they need $5.5 billion of additional investment. I think Portugal gave $1 million. So okay, there's a 5.5 billion less a million.
Yeah, but there's also Netherlands with 5 million, but I think this is to introduce the TFFF within World Bank's framework. It's not part of the investment case.
Okay.
But then still, so we need another 5.5 billion, and both Germany and the UK, who were like very close supporters of the mechanism, did not announce any money for the TFFF for now, right? But
Yeah.
following the news pretty closely in the last couple of days, obviously, both countries are now debating whether they should actually put money into this. And rumor has it that we are even talking about 2 or 3 billion here. Not so sure about that information, but we might end up like over the next year at 10 billion, maybe. So let's quickly talk about what a 10 billion TFFF would mean for forest protection, for the mechanism, and how the whole thing could go down in the next couple of decades. Yeah, do
Sure.
you want to
I
go
mean,
ahead?
10 billion, it sounds great, right? If they get 10 billion, then they could attract under the scheme, right? With the leverage, they'd be looking at another $40 billion of institutional investment. So they'd end up with an investment of $50 billion in total. And then they could, obviously make their goal is to make their 3% on that.
Right.
So, but it's actually it's going to run into problems of scale.
Right. So, obviously, as always, there is a post about the mini TFFF, and this is one of my most favorite pictures of the newsletter, I gotta say. So, just to walk through this step by step, the issue with a mini TFFF is kind of multifold, right? But first, let's think about the 10 billion is actually achieved within the first year. One of the arguments is, well, this is only the beginning. But over time, there will be additional billions, and we will end up at 25 billion. And obviously, this is a kind of like a political analysis. So we as economists might not be the first people to speak about this, but can you give your ideas on the feasibility of the claim that the other 15 billion will somehow come about in the next couple of years?
Sure. I mean, I think the issue here is that the TFFF is only going to be able to attract more money if it really delivers on its core promise of slowing down deforestation, of bringing lots of money to tropical forest countries, right? If it doesn't do that, then I think, probably other countries or even the countries that have already invested would say, well, we're not going to give more if, in fact, it's not really doing anything. So the question is, what's it? Suppose it gets its $10 billion and then brings another 40 billion of institutional investment. And will it actually be able to do what it promises to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Let's walk through this step by step. So with a $50 billion TFFF, obviously, if you believe that the 3% are up for grabs, this would lead to 1.5 billion of revenue, at least before cost, within the framework, right? But as we just
Sure.
discussed, there won't be 3% up for grabs, but a maximum of 1%. So 1% of the 50 billion would be down to 500 million a year, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that
And
seems like a bit of a problem.
right. So 500 million, if we think about the 1 billion hectares of rainforest, rather than paying out $4 per hectare, which has been promised with the big TFFF and the full threat, reality kind of hits quite hard here, because if you only invest 50 billion and then you only have 1% of revenue, we are down to 500 million, so only 50 cents per hectare of rainforest, right?
Well, if that, I mean, you still have to pay your costs.
Exactly, exactly.
So I'm thinking if I'm, a bureaucrat working at the TFFF or one of their bankers, I guess I'd go, well, hey, we want to keep this gig going. Let's just make sure we continue to generate this money because we're getting paid and we're getting, basically there's this wonderful international institution which is operating forever and has the word forest in its title. We should preserve this. And
Right.
also it happens to pay my salary. And so, of course, what you would expect is they're going to be quite happy with it. But the amount of money that's going to go to tropical forests in these circumstances is minuscule, zero, whatever. It'd be very, very small,
So
and maybe just enough to be able to say, hey, we paid out a few million to tropical forest countries last year. Let's keep it going.
So, talking about the expected revenue and cost in more detail now. So 50 billion, 1% is 500 million in revenue. And in the full TFFF model, we talked about 0.5% for cost and 0.5% for actual returns towards rainforests. But how does the cost structure look in a kind of mini TFFF?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that the TFFF's management costs wouldn't change at all, right? They'd still have to do all the same things as they were planning to do if it had been the full scale thing. So, if management costs are $300 million a year or something, then you're kind of running into a problem that you really don't have much money left for forests. And then you have to pay for your financial management fees because the managers now, maybe they don't have 125 billion to play with. They don't have as many bonds to issue. So it's a little bit cheaper, but the costs are still pretty substantial. So
Mhm.
it's hard to imagine that every last cent wouldn't be eaten up by management fees and financial fees with just, a tiny bit left over for the rainforest countries, because after all, it would be the tropical forests for tropical forest forever facility.
Right. But I mean, just to stress that this is quite a drastic analysis here, right? So a mini TFFF with only 50 billion at hand would only generate on average, not in bad years, on average, 500 million in return, and at least 300 million would be needed to do the financial fees, the financial management cost, the tracking of deforestation,
At
the
least. Yeah.
right. Then the all the bargaining and the law cases coming about because recipient countries don't agree with the evaluation of their deforestation. and the monitoring of where the premiums are flowing into, because it needs to be controlled that all the money being paid out to rainforest countries are actually, all that money is actually being spent on rainforest projects. So even if this is quite a well-functioning, efficient mechanism and only costs 300 million, there would only be 200 million to be distributed to rainforest countries. And
Or
200
about
million, going back to the per hectare, we are talking 20 cents a hectare here in the TFFF model.
and a penalty of $20 if you lose a hectare.
The penalty is $20. And this is super important now, right? Because a
Right.
lot of people have rightly said that the $4, $400 concept is not enough to create the right incentives. And why that might be a bit unfair, because, well, you have to start somewhere. And if it's successful, you can like scale it up. What is surely like agreeable for most people would be that the $4 and the $400 is some kind of like minimum payment for setting the right incentives, right? And if we are talking 20 cents and $20, well, it's ridiculous, right? There's no incentive for actual behavior change in that mechanism at all.
Right. And so the result would be, of course, it becomes really difficult to imagine anyone saying, hey, I want to give more money to this thing because I'm really happy to see all the, I'm going to take on all this risk. And then basically, a bunch of bureaucrats and some banks are making good money from it.
Right. So I would actually kind of like extend this line of argument and saying even if there would be like willingness to invest in the TFFF, realizing that the current model is too small, um, a lot of people have rightly said that this is the rainforest COP, right? All eyes are on Beleng, all eyes are on the rainforest. And if with all the pressure that is going on right now, and the COP30 in Brazil is considered to be the most decisive COP since a long time because it's the first one to prove that countries can do global commons financing, climate protection, environmental protection without the US, because Trump opted out of all these negotiations when he took power. The pressure is high. You really want to have success this time. And if sponsor countries only come up with like something between 4.5 and 5.5 billion for now, maybe a couple more billions if Germany and the UK pay something into the TFFF. I just don't see any scenario where additional money will flow next year and the year after, because the narrative will just shift, right? The eyes that are now on the rainforest will move on. And just like in financial mechanisms like the loss and damage fund, I can't really imagine there to be any additional funding after this year and this funding period.
I think it also just depends on whether it was successful, right? And the
Yeah,
problem is if it's too small, it can't be successful,
right.
and therefore it's not going to attract more funds because it will be unsuccessful. I mean, it just won't actually change anyone's behavior, and the money will be eaten up, in financial fees and management costs. So, I mean, maybe that's the goal of governments. Maybe that's what they want, but I hope not.
Oh man. Yeah, it's really weird. So to wrap up this whole mini TFFF topic, um, if the TFFF is becoming too small, the expected revenue is shrinking as well. There's only 1% of revenue before cost, and the cost will be even higher than 0.5% with a shrinking TFFF because costs are not proportional to the size of the TFFF, right? All its administration, all its management needs to be done anyway. The monitoring needs to be done anyway, and doubling the size of the fund for sure doesn't lead to a doubling of the cost. And the same way is true for halving it. Halving the fund doesn't mean you can halve the cost. So there won't be any or hardly any expected return in rainforest premiums, maybe 200 or 300 million every year, but that is only the expected amount, right? What we haven't talked about now is the high danger of the TFFF due to its leveraged construction, maybe going downhill, imploding, going bankrupt, ending all forest country premiums at all, really. But what happens, Aidan, if the fund really goes bankrupt, if significant shares of the initial amount are being lost? Is it just being closed down, or what happens then?
I mean, I think it would be not straightforward. There's the idea is it's being set up with long-term bonds.
Right.
So the TFFF would have to be kept on life support no matter what, because it will have issued bonds.
Right.
Um, and somehow those are going to have to be taken care of. And so, one outcome might be that basically the TFFF might be managed, ultimately by some, it might end up under a sort of bankruptcy management where it was being managed down so that it could pay off all of its obligations to the institutional investors who had invested in it. And, there would just be kind of this long-term kind of financial decay as it paid those off and then kept on paying its financial managers to keep on essentially managing the whole asset. I mean, a terrible risk is that basically it turns into a huge negative
Right.
that, and, there have been some promises that it will be the finances will be managed very well and it will be extremely diversified and no country or something will be able to have more than 4%. I think there's a promise that no more than 4% would be invested in any single asset,
Right.
not necessarily a country. The thing is, often emerging market bonds are correlated in terms of their returns and in terms of the risks that they face. For example, we've seen quite substantial risk to many emerging markets from changes in tariff policy in the United States recently, or if there were a war, or if climate change caused, significant problems in, a large number of countries at once, which is quite feasible, right? I mean, this is, of course, one of the big risks of climate change. All those things could happen, and they could really cause significant losses such that the sponsor country capital all disappeared, and the whole thing would, at that point, really lose credibility and lose the ability to continue to pay anything meaningful to the tropical forest countries. And I think it's
Right.
also worth pointing out that even without defaults, even if that never happens, a fund which is running at $50 billion in total per of capital would not have enough, after you account for the costs, would not have enough to make the kind of payments to tropical forest countries that have been committed as what's required to really make an impact in terms of incentives.
Right. Um, so maybe diving into this issue a bit more and then thinking about a solution to the whole process. We've been publishing two newsletters really. One was from Fragile Finance to Stable Forests, where we um, kind of elaborated on what is really needed to make this work. What do recipient countries need to actually be able to significantly change their behavior? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, I think, I mean, tropical forest countries need a commitment of stable finance, right? It's if you're going to, for example, try to protect your forest, then you need to have, well-funded government ministry to do that. You need to be able to pay out regularly.
Right.
If you're not convinced that the money's going to come in next year, then what are you going to do? You want to you want to have a whole big bureaucracy that's unfunded? You can't, you have to hire people on the basis of knowing that you're going to be able to pay them next year. And so you can't really run a tropical forest protection scheme if you don't know whether it's going to be there if there's going to be money there next year. And you can even see that if you have uncertainty, if you think there's going to be no money in the next 3 years, for example, because of losses in emerging market bond markets, then you might go, this is the time to cut down some forests.
Right.
And yeah, and because we aren't going to be penalized for it this year, because there's no rewards this year, so nothing to penalize. I mean, the way this thing works is in order to penalize countries, you have to have rewards. And if there's no reward to be paid, you can't penalize them.
Yeah.
So it's basically creating really perverse and weird incentives if you have uncertainty.
Yeah, what I like to do when discussing this topic is like kind of putting yourself in the shoes of like chief executive for rainforest protection of a country like Indonesia, for example. And what the TFFF is designed for in its core is to incentivize the rainforest countries to change their behavior, right? And the change of behavior would be to enforce stronger rainforest protection policies, to channel money into fire protection, to channel money into some kind of like rainforest ranger crew that would protect the forest, monitor whether there's illegal logging going on, which plays a huge role in this. And to fund all these projects, and I think this is a very decisive point in there, a lot of donor countries now say that they can't really contribute anymore into the TFFF because our budgets in Germany, in the UK, in France are under very high pressure right now, right? But then if you really think that the national budgets of the UK and Germany are under pressure, think about the pressure of budgets in Brazil or Indonesia, right? These countries can't finance rainforest protection on their own. It's just not feasible. So the only chance for them to invest money into measures such as stronger enforcement, stronger protection, is that they can trust that there will be money flowing every year so that the costs that they have to spend on their rainforest policies are being coped for by that rewards that the TFFF is paying out. But then if you link these rewards to the annual fluctuations of bond markets, there is just no trust, right? You never know whether something bad happens, whether there's like loss in trust in emerging market economies. And absurdly enough, a lot of rainforest countries are also emerging markets, right? It could be that countries such as Brazil or Indonesia come under scrutiny on financial markets. Their budget pressure would be even higher. And if they are at the maximum financial pressure, then we would also, as the Global North, say, hey, listen, thank you for all the policies you set up and all the money that you already spent on these policies. We promised we would give you money, but unfortunately, financial markets didn't quite deliver. So now you have to pay for all the people that you put to work in forest protection. You have to pay these wages on your own because the market didn't deliver, right? And that really shows how absurd this idea is to link these rewards to bond market performances. I mean, maybe to give a bit more background, and we did that in our introduction, that is kind of what we are really the experts about, right? It's results-based finance mechanisms, incentives, and I dared to name this the golden rule of pay-for-performance mechanisms or of results-based payment mechanisms. If these fundings are not reliable, long-term, and trustworthy, the effect in behavior change is just really, really minor, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to ask someone to do something continuously, which needs to be done continuously and on a long-term basis, but then to say, but the money is really contingent on something completely independent of whatever you're doing.
Okay. But then what is the solution to all this, Aidan? What does the TFFF need as some kind of like quick fix? What is our demand to improve the TFFF and to make
I
it
mean,
work?
what would be nice is something that had basically stable money, less money spent on financing costs. That would be good.
Right.
And more money that actually just goes reliably to tropical rainforest countries so that they can do what they're supposed to do with the TFFF. So we think that roughly $2.5 billion a year is kind of what's required right now in order to make a significant difference. And if you wanted to get to the problem is that, and I think, you know, every country that receives money, you know, through foreign aid recognizes this problem is that if the aid flows are not dependable, then, well, you haven't fixed the problem.
Right.
So we think that the right way to do this is actually to have a loan to the TFFF at a 0% interest rate. And that loan would enable them to get essentially to then invest the money back into something that would pay interest that they could then rely on.
Right.
So the the kind of thing that we're thinking of is something like, in total, $50 billion of concessional lending at 0% interest for a 20-year loan. And that 50 billion would then be invested right back into the government bonds of the countries that were lending the money in the first place. The difference being that the government bonds would then pay interest to the TFFF, so the TFFF could use that money for supporting tropical forest countries in exactly the same way that the TFFF has proposed, creating incentives.
Right. So what we need is 2.5 billion for some kind of like start for the first 10, 12, 15 years, right? Because right now there's still deforestation, and 2.5 billion would be enough to get the TFFF going for now. 2.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, and you also refer to 50 billion being needed. So let's dive into that a bit deeper. Of course, 2.5 billion seems a lot of money on an annual basis, but we discussed earlier that there's all kinds of potential donor countries, right? We have the UK, we have Germany, we have Norway, there's France, there's the United Arab Emirates, China has been in the discussion before. So let's boil it down and make it simple and say there's 5 potential contributors to the stable TFFF facility that we are thinking about. So the 2.5 billion could be put into like 5 separate chunks of 500 million per country, right? And you already said that it's a bit challenging to get this 500 million in long-term payments. Let's dive into that a bit deeper. So I would be the UK government, and you are the TFFF facility. How would that exactly work? So I need to invest not 50 billion, but only a fifth of that. So 10 billion is needed, and I'm giving that money to you, right?
Right. And then as part of the deal, I would then take that $10 billion and invest it back into UK government bonds, or
Right.
gilts as they're called. And I would then basically earn the interest from that. So that way, uh, essentially from the UK government's perspective, the only thing really that's happening financially is that the TFFF would be getting the interest from those bonds paid annually. And the benefit of that is it couldn't be overturned, right? So if,
Right.
in 3 years' time, there's a new government and they say, oh, we don't like tropical forests. Well, they're still stuck with it because the loan is still there. It was a 20-year loan.
Right. Okay. So, and I wouldn't even like really need the 10 billion, right? It's a bit weird and it seems some kind of like budgetary trick we are playing here, but I would give you the 10 billion and I wouldn't take any yield for that. And then you would give me my money back, but I have to pay a 5% interest to you now, right?
Exactly.
So I would kind of have my money back the same day, right? I
Yeah,
don't really, okay, so the 10 billion are not really needed. It's just like financial gaming to allow for this long-term debt that I need to pay no matter how my next elections would look like. I can't opt
exactly.
out of these payments. Okay, that makes sense. We are also already talking for more than an hour. So I think wrapping it up for now and then coming up with additional episodes in the near future makes a lot of sense. Is there anything you want to stress before we wrap this up? Is there another point that you want to raise?
Sure. I think it's actually really important to say, although it sounds expensive, to do that strategy where you engage in concessional lending, it's not as if the current strategy of the TFF really is free for
Right.
sponsor countries. Essentially, they're really just taking on a lot of risk. And so instead of having stable financing, which is what we're proposing, what you're doing is you're creating this uncertain financing for tropical forest countries and then massive risks for sponsor countries, which instead of giving like reasonable amounts every year, might suddenly be stuck with having lost, like $20 billion collectively. So it's really kind of it's not as if stable financing is somehow more expensive than that. It's less expensive because you don't have all this wasteful financing costs.
Yeah, and that's what's so weird to me in this whole TFFF discussion because I think a lot of people actually understand that in a full TFFF with 25 billion on the line, this money is actually on the line, right? You kind of throw it on the roulette table and hope that the right numbers or colors or whatever appear for the first couple of years to get the TFFF working, at least in short term. But I can't really wrap my head around why people would prefer this super risky gamble over honest, stable, and long-term funding. Because yeah, one point I really want to stress here, well, two maybe. We are talking about $500 million, and $500 million per country, it sounds like a lot. But as you know, Aidan, I just moved to Berlin some time ago, and the restoration of our state library here at Unter den Linden, close to the Brandenburg Gate, it costs 680 million, I think it's even euros and not dollars. So all we are talking here is the cost of a restoration of an old state library. It's not that much money if you put it into perspective. Other economists who have been talking about the TFFF talked about military spending and how billions and billions are being spent there on like fighter jets, right? They cost more than $100 million for every single jet. So it's kind of, it is a lot of money, obviously, for private people. 500 million is an unimaginable large amount. But if you boil it down to other state expenses, it's not that much money in the end. And then on top of that, what I really want to stress is stable funding does cost money, but every single state expense costs money because there is no free lunch, right? If you want to pay for healthcare, you have to pay for healthcare. And if you want to pay for forest protection, you actually have to pay for forest protection. And as we elaborated on in this talk, the incentive structure is completely broken. This house of cards collapses even if the gamble works out for some time, because none of the recipient countries can actually trust that the money will actually flow. So you have super high risk. You have your reputational risk as well. Just imagine if, political parties that are rather critical about global commons cooperation would have the chance to say those idiot globalists tried to beat the market and then they miserably failed. And Trump could say the American voters can be so happy that we were not part of this. It would be a disaster if this goes wrong, right? So you have
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
What are the chances? I mean, basically, what you have is a multilateral institution which has
Right,
announced what its financial strategy is going to be, and
right.
it's fixed. And it's basically hoping to beat the market. It's like everyone else knows what your financial strategy is. I think they're going to take advantage of you, and they're much more nimble and flexible than you.
Right. Yeah, I can't. So the current version, it's super high risk, it's rather low expected return, and it has hardly any incentive structure with it because no one can trust that the rewards will actually being paid out over the next couple of years. And the alternative, solid funding, which is like a lot of money, but totally feasible. It's only 500 million from 5 donor countries and would be far enough to set the TFFF up for the first decade, to say the least. So I really can't grasp what happened behind the political curtains, why the TFFF could move ahead, and if most of the stakeholders really thought that there is a free lunch, a magic money tree, if states start to gamble on international bond markets on a loan with private capital as leverage. It seems so absurd to me.
Yeah, speculation to make money. I mean, well, it might work out, I guess, but
Yeah,
probably
but
not.
one more point, and we really need to wrap this up, but one more point is not a single state expense is being paid this way, right? None
Yeah.
of it. The state as a speculator on financial markets to fund some payments in the future, it's just not happening. The opposite is true. Um, maybe we should do a quick excursion to the Norwegian State Fund, and we will not do that right now. That's the cliffhanger everyone was waiting for. The next episode will start with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and what their perspective on emerging market debt is. Um, Aidan, thank you so much for taking the time. And
This was fun.
as I've learned from other podcasts, now is the time to say, dear listeners, dear viewers, like and subscribe, like this video, subscribe to our TFFF Missing Billions channel, and also spread the words. If you have any questions, get in contact with us. We are really happy to elaborate further on specific points. And Aidan, the last word is up for you. Go ahead with however you want to close this down.
All right. Thank you so much. I do want to emphasize one more time, we're really supportive of the TFFF. We just want
Right.
it to be funded properly.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks a lot,
Exactly.
Max. Bye for
Thank
now,
you so
everyone.
much.